Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. It's always my pleasure to have back with me today Charles Hugh Smith, well-known and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Welcome back, Charles.
Thank you, Gordon. It's always my pleasure to be on the program.
Charles, I think we have a very interesting topic today that I'm sure a lot of our listeners have personal views and experiences on, or know people who have been involved in what we're going to talk about. And we've labeled this video Forced Migration in America. And we're going to discuss today not only from where and to where Americans are moving, but additionally that many retirees, an example, specifically find them in a position that in fact they are forced into relocation, in my opinion. And as I said, we'll get into that in more detail. I have the agenda up here now that we'll be discussing. Recently I've been taking the lead, but today you will. So with that, let's start with some facts on why Americans are moving.
Okay, very good, Gordon. I think the basic dynamics that we're going to get into here are costs of just living, basic living expenses, rent, food, dining out, commuting cost, owning a house. All of these expenses are rising much faster than most people's income in these high cost urban areas that have created a lot of the jobs in the last decade. And so as costs rise, income is not matching it. And so people are getting squeezed. And we're going to discuss that it's across the whole demographic spectrum. In other words, young people can't afford to buy homes and start families in these places. Old people can't afford to retire there. And the people that are in the middle, they're getting squeezed and wondering what the future is holding for them as they see taxes and fees and property taxes continue going higher. So we're going to kind of break that out.
Good, Charles. If I can interrupt, I'll add a fourth category to that, besides the low, middle, and generally the upper. But then it's the wealthy who are also moving, but they're actually moving outside of America in a big way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So all four categories, if you were to break them, have got reasons right now. They've got problems.
Right. And as you mentioned before we started recording, we're fairly confident that most of you listeners either know someone or you may be considering moving yourself. Like, this is a large scale demographic migration in America, and it's we feel, Gordon and I feel, that it's unprecedented, at least in terms of the motivations that are driving it. And the key point I want to bring up here at the start is these dynamics are self-reinforcing. In other words, as costs go up for municipalities and counties, they have to raise taxes because their cost structure is fixed by law. And so then you get a self-reinforcing dynamic. As people move out, the tax base shrinks, then they have to raise the taxes on who's left. And so that's one of the things we're going to talk about. Is this is not a temporary phenomenon, is what I'm saying. It's not the result of some 2-year trend. We're talking about multi-decade trends that are in action here. So you have a great chart here, Gordon, showing price changes between domestic services and imported goods. And this is the heart of the inflation that's really squeezing working Americans. Is the non-tradable, which is one term for domestic services. The costs are just going through the roof. And there's a chart here that you posted of San Francisco Bay Area rents, and it's like a geometric ascent. And so, yeah, what can you say?
It's not unique to just the West Coast, okay? Up here in Boston, it's the same in all different areas. Maybe not quite as steep, but no matter where it is, the rentals or cost prices are right at the point where they're almost, if not unaffordable. But there are areas that are still out there in certain parts of the country where they're behind. They're moving to those areas. And as we were talking about earlier, and as you mentioned, unfortunately, when they move there, they're driving up the prices because they have expectations. You say you move out of California and your house is worth $1 million, and you move up to Idaho. You have a whole different view when you see the house is $350,000. And you say, well, bid it up for 400,000. We'll get what we want. Well, the locals, you think they're not a little ticked off about that, right? And because all of a sudden all this California money, and I'm not picking on California, just using example, are making it difficult for them. And I'm seeing that in South Carolina, North Carolina, many areas in the United States and outside the states for that matter.
Right, right. And so we have a slide here where we talk about the migration of the middle class, but we also wanted to mention that young households are burdened with student loan debt. And of course that's well over $1 trillion now debt. And so phenomenon. It didn't exist in the past, right? We didn't have people struggling to pay student loans. So that's made it more and more difficult for young families to buy in these pricey urban areas. And so they're forced to move if they want to have a family. And Chris Hamilton has done a lot of great work on that demographic. And you have a chart here called the economic doom loop well underway. And maybe you can talk to this, Gordon, about the local government services and how that it's like a loop that's really trapped, that the local governments are trapped in these really high pension costs.
By law, the unfunded liabilities with pension in the country is staggering. Public pensions, never mind even the corporate pensions. We lose track when we talk about the federal pensions and the state pensions. It's my worry, Charles, and what I see, it's down below that, if that's not a big enough problem, because I think they total $6 trillion of unfunded. But you get down to the cities and the towns, and they have no way out of funding their pensions of all their police department, their fire department, waterworks. I live in a small town in New England. They haven't properly put money aside for most of the workers. Now that with the baby boomers, they're starting to retire, and they've given them very generous pensions. And they had expectations many years ago, and they had to compete to get people to come to the town of offering them these pensions. So they're relatively young and they're retiring, but there's no money set aside. So what do? You're the mayor of the town, the selectman. The only thing left you got to raise the property taxes. So you got a lot of these towns are bedroom communities. They've got people have big jobs. Their houses are worth a lot of money. They're commuting. They have high expectations of services. What do? You start increasing the property taxes. And the property taxes I don't think people appreciate how big those your property taxes are going to be 3 years, 5 years, and 8 years from now. If you want to start budgeting retirement inflation, you better take a good look at your property tax, because it's not getting uncommon now that your property tax could be double what you're getting from your Social Security check. And with people not having pensions anymore, where's your cash flow? So you got to sell your house. But then, there's no such thing as cheap real estate anywhere in America. Relatively less, maybe, but it's not cheap. Didn't mean you get long-winded there, but it's just a massive problem. And they have no choices, as you said, Charles, too, is they have to do it by law. The unions have made sure it was written into law. There's no way out. They'll be sued, which is another problem. They can't they just can't renege on it unless they just totally go broke.
Something that's really important that's somewhat less it's more difficult to measure, but is the sacrifices required to live in these high cost urban areas as these urban problems become embedded in the social and economic structure. And this is part of the economic doom loop is, with housing prices skyrocketing, so there's no cheap apartments left, then that feeds homelessness, and then there's higher demand for services. So, on top of the requirement to raise taxes to cover existing pension obligations, there's a tremendous pressure on cities and counties to deal with embedded homelessness and decaying infrastructure. And so that adds a whole nother layer of taxes and fees. And so in my experience in California and in Hawaii is, water bills, to rebuild and keep up the infrastructure on sewers and water supply, that's up like 40%, every 2 years. Municipal trash pickup, up 60% over a few years. And so all of this stuff there's no way out. It's really Tina. There is no alternative, right? The public is demanding more services, and yet there's not enough money. And so there's a huge cost to that. If you're living in an urban area where you paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for your small little house and you've got homeless encampments right down the street, your kids can't go out and play because there's needles. Your commute is horrible. You got to stand up in the train. Trains are falling apart. This is urban America for many, many people. And it's like, what's the point? I mean, what's the payoff here? And so if that's what's forcing this migration too, is people are going, hey, access access to fine dining and the cultural benefits of a big city, it's not worth it anymore. I don't have any time or money to enjoy all that stuff. So I'm out. I'm gone.
So true, Charles, what you're saying. There's two camps here. There's, I'll call it the young professionals. Both people are working. Maybe then they can afford the first child or their second child, but they're typically having long commutes to get to work. So they're working in a center that is commutable, but it's cutting their days down where they're having to leave godly hours in the morning and home, both of them. So they have very limited time. They're able to sort of make the ends meet, but they have no idea how they're going to get the kids through college, and they have no pension, so they're not sure how they're going to retire. So in spite of their big incomes and big titles and big jobs that they've worked really hard getting through graduate schools and etc., they're fundamentally broke. Now, so that's one group of them. You say, well, they're really well off, but they're not. Now you're outside the city, but they haven't got time to cut their lawn. They haven't do their landscaping and all of the other issues that come with living, the services end of it. So all the people who do the services, who don't commute all the way into the big city, who grown up typically in those areas, and we can go through all of the services. We did a whole show on it. Well, they have to live there too. They need a house. Well, these others have driven up the housing prices, and they need the services. So what's happening is they're in turn forced the service providers, the plumber, the electrician, the landscaper, et cetera, to drive up their fees. So it's those who have the money are getting further and further behind, and those who don't are have tremendous pressure to push up. It's this self-reinforcing. And there, many of them are seeing the only way out of it is to leave, okay, is to change locations, especially on the number of things that have changed in the last few years, what I call the 5 new catalysts. Hey, by the way, Charles, maybe it's a good time. I didn't mean to go on, but maybe the 5 new catalysts that kind of wrap this part of it up too. Can I mention those, or would that help?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Go
because
right ahead.
what's happened in my mind and what I see is there's a series of these catalysts are new. They've either just happened in the last year, but the last few years. And a few years ago we were talking about the gutting of the middle class back in 2008 because we were moving away from defined benefits to contributory benefits. But one of the catalysts is people don't have pension plans anymore unless you were a government employee or something like that. But generally, people don't have pensions. That's a whole new set of problems. So you're retiring. You can't retire on your Social Security check anymore. It just doesn't make a go of it. So there's one, you have no defined benefits. I mentioned the rising property taxes, which is frankly early in the cycle and getting worse at a significant rate in at least 5 of the 6 major states I could talk about. They see a lack of financial stability in the particular states that they're living in. Illinois is a classic example of that. I could argue New York, New Jersey, California, but that lack of financial stability says that what they're seeing is a looming state pension liability problem that the state, I remember I was talking about the cities and the towns, now we're talking about the state, and they're seeing the state pension liability problem coming, and they're legally bound, and they say, the only way they're going to pay for it, it's coming back through property taxes, and increasing sales taxes. And then just in the last year, Trump changed the tax laws. So now your mortgage deductibility is limited, is capped, and then a lot of people are now retiring. They still have mortgages, which is I found shocking to me. But when I did the numbers, yeah, it's quite perfectly understandable. So there's 5 different catalysts in there that are relatively new. So people are adjusting to them. And with the other problems we were just talking about, you were just taking us through, they're saying, what are my options? And they have to leave. But they see this as one option is to leave where they're currently living.
Right. And in a similar vein, I mentioned here in one of the slides about the tax exodus slide that you have here is that it used to be that you would move to the New York area or the Los Angeles area or Seattle or the Bay Area or Dallas. You would move to these places because there was opportunities for everybody in the economic spectrum. In other words, even if you were in the lower skill range, there was still a place for you. And now many of these regions, I would say the majority of the really high cost regions, are dominated by winner take most dynamics. In other words, if you took the average wage or even the median wage, it looks like it's going up very tremendously, right? But if you break it out, it turns out that most of the income gains are going to the top 5%. And so that means that only the people who are in that winner class of maybe the top 10%, maybe the top 20 in some areas, but never more than the top 20% can actually afford to buy a house. And so the top 20% is doing much better in these winner take most economies, but the bottom, I would say 95% personally, but you could argue the bottom 80%, are falling further and further behind. And you make a point here that the high tax states consume whatever increases in income the household does earn. So, you get a 2%, raise, and your local taxes and fees go up by 5%. So you're losing ground unless you're one of the winner take most, and that creates a really high stress urban zone where you think if you live in a lower cost area of the U.S. you'd think, gosh, if we could make $250,000 a year, we would be golden. I mean, it would be like fantastic. We could save so much money. Hey, $250,000 in places like the San Francisco area or the New York area, Boston area, Seattle, it's not enough to survive if you've got kids and student loans and other normal expenses. You're barely hanging on. That's a phenomenal challenge.
It is stunning, isn't it? But it's true. I don't know how many people I've listened to telling me that, and got big jobs, and I know what their salaries are, and they're having a tough time making a go of it. They can't put money aside. It's just stunning, and that's up here in the greater Boston area.
Yeah, so you have a great map here. Maybe you can speak to where people are leaving and then where are they going.
I thought that this was really, really interesting. Some of them are pretty obvious. We look at California, the blue states, and I'm not being political here, but all the reasons we're talking, one of them now is because of the tax laws and the capping of the mortgage deductibility. They're now seeing they want to get some of their equity out of their homes and buy down, but they're locked in because they don't have a fixed defined benefits pension plan. And they don't have the cash flow even from Social Security and their investments that are not making really enough in many cases in terms of income versus capital gains. And so they're leaving. So you see California circuit, Illinois is just a huge migration, 9% here going at a kind of an annualized basis. I mean, who's going to be left in Illinois? You see New York up here at 9.6%, but right along the coast, a lot of the coastal areas, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, real estate has driven them out. But there are other areas too that you can see some pretty negative numbers. So in those cases, what I see is it's not necessarily that the costs are getting out of line, it's that the whole demographics is coming into play. And that's something we haven't really talked about. And by demographics, I'm talking about they're baby boomers. They're now nearing or they're at retirement age. And this is the stage where, and Harry Dent's done a lot of work on this, of the cycle of what people spend their money at certain ages. And we have a 75 to 80 million baby boomers who are at the age where what they usually start to look at this age is they're looking at retirement homes, cottages. They used to be local at the local pond or lake. Now they're looking a lot broader and out of state to make their moves. So a lot of these moderate areas through the Midwest, they're actually losing people for that reason, and also jobs. They've got to go. They've got to work longer because they don't have a pension, and their jobs are going away, and they've got to go find a job at another place. But they're moving away from the coast and the high real estate areas. There's just no question, and at a significant and accelerating rate. Maybe we want to talk about where they're going to, Charles.
Yeah, go right ahead. You've got a great
This
slide here. Why don't you talk about it?
this chart shows that where they're going to. They're heading to what I'll call this western corridor. Get away from California, so they're going into some of these other areas, like you see Idaho here. Fairly good growth. Arizona, they're going into Nevada. They're going close by, so there's a migration that way. Remember, Nevada has no state taxes. You move from California with a 7.8% sales tax. Never mind your state taxes, and you move to Nevada or Wyoming, and there's no state taxes at all. I mean, that is a big increase in income. Texas has no state taxes, and in places like Montana and Oregon on this coast, they have no sales taxes. Never mind the state taxes. So there's that element. But they're also moving to on the East Coast. Without question, Florida has been a big mover. Another place that has no state taxes, has manageable sales taxes. But I'm seeing, and the statistics here shows they're moving into the Carolinas and Tennessee in a big way. Look at the numbers there: nearly 10%, 7%, 6% kind of growth rates. Again, because it's closer to the coast, but the property taxes and the real estate is much less. But it's accelerating. These values are going up at a significant rate. But the commonality in here, it's whether it's property taxes, whether it's sales taxes, whether it's state income taxes, or combinations thereof that they're cherry picking. Does that pass your common sense test, Charles? And certainly the statistics say that's a fact.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you have a great slide here showing, focusing on Arizona, but it's typical of the high growth states, is these places have jobs and people move to cities that are job engines, right? And so that's why you're seeing Dallas, Atlanta, and many of the urban areas in the Carolinas attracting huge increases in population. Is they're also engines of job creation. But I want to mention, and maybe you can speak to that further, but I want to mention this note here that the Rust Belt cities that have retained their amenities and job markets are also picking up people. And, we've for decades, we've been hearing about, the upper Midwest losing population as the manufacturing has been gutted for all the reasons we've talked about in the past. But some of these areas have done a better job than others in terms of retaining jobs. For example, there's trade, there's universities, there's research, there's healthcare, and they've also done a better job of retaining their infrastructure. And so, housing in these cities is a bargain. And I know people personally who have moved to places like Cincinnati and cities in Ohio, because they can afford a house for what seems to be a ludicrously small sum, like under $100,000 in a decent neighborhood, or under $150,000, if for a really nice house that would cost, pushing $1 million in high cost places. And so they're willing to take, maybe it's a trade off. Maybe they're willing to take a little hit on the weather. But they're able to afford a house that they can look forward to paying off, and they still have a job and they have amenities. And so there's also, I guess the point here is there is a migration within areas that people are leaving places with high costs and low opportunities and moving to places that have retained or better managed. Let's put it that way.
And higher quality of life.
Yes.
And, there's different reasons that different people are moving, and we kind of mixing around. So, some of these states, it's not all, a lot of people, the pensioners and the older people, without question, it's a tax issue. And those that are making income, But you get into the younger group that have got student loans, their issue is having a standard of life now that's decent and affordability. So it's just not just housing, but it's rent costs, but also quality of life. The universities are important, colleges are important to them, etc. So that's why it's not just so clear, right, which states. So you see some of them moving around, but some of them are, as we talked about, are very, very blatant. There's a whole mixed bag of people and a mixed bag of reasons that are in here. Some stand out a little bit larger than others. But one of the things we haven't talked about, Charles, too, is we keep talking about people moving from state to other states. But and I mentioned kind of at the beginning, but there's another group that are just simply leaving America, and they're finding land and property because to avoid, they're still going to pay U.S. taxes because we tax no matter where you are, but they can really make their money work for them in a much bigger way. And two examples that just jump out at me is one, try and buy some coastal property in Costa Rica right now, even close to the coast, and it's all Americans. Generally, although there's a lot of Europeans too, but it's generally Americans are down there in huge ways. And it frustrates the locals because it's driving up these properties, the same as discussions we had in the States. But I was talking to somebody here just yesterday, just back from New Zealand, an American, and I'd asked him why New Zealand, and he bought land down there quite a few years ago. But he says, but now they hate Americans. And I said, pardon, New Zealand? That's not the New Zealand that I know and love. And he says, well, he says, maybe I'm being a little strong on that. He says, but what, so many Americans have moved in, I didn't realize that, and have been moving in, and they've driven up property prices in real estate, and the locals now, it's same as we were just talking about earlier, it's driving up their ability to buy what they want, because there isn't necessarily the industrial base that's going to pay those levels of salaries that they can afford. It's not that these people are coming into work, they're coming in to retire. I can remember just a while ago, Matt Lauer, and before you at NBC went out, he with $50 million salary, he'd bought a great big complex in New Zealand. That's just an example. They're leaving the country and finding these lands and then effectively hurting the areas that they're going to. It's like hot money we always talk about, but it's usually corporate hot money coming in and driving up corporate prices and takeovers. This time it's personal money. Have you seen
Right.
examples of that, Charles, at all?
Yeah, and Gordon, and I think that same dynamic is in play within the states, that there's two categories of migrants in the U.S. People who are having to work, their income is still being earned by their labor, and they're having to move to lower costs, but also they have to find a job. And so that's their calculus, their trade-off. But there's a whole other group of people that you just mentioned that tend to be upper middle class or wealthy, who no longer need to get a job. And so I have read stories about these kinds of people moving to places like Idaho or the Carolinas. They don't need to find a job. In fact, they might start a business there because they're entrepreneurial spirits and they have the capital to do so. And so that can actually benefit these places, despite the locals' complaints about rising property values, which is legitimate and a concern. But all this new capital flowing in can generate growth and more jobs, and that can be beneficial if it's managed properly. But Gordon, one thing my last comment here would be, we're seeing, I think part of what the migration is, people who are looking ahead with an informed analysis of these trends we're talking about, how taxes are going to go up and how these urban problems are not going to be solved. Those people are moving. They're looking ahead and anticipating the trends, and they're saying now's the time to get out while I can still do so. People who believe the status quo is permanent and is always going to continue on. In other words, property prices in San Francisco are going to go from $1.5 million to $2 million to $2.5 million and so on. And their job is going to continue to go up in value. Those people are going to stay, but only one camp is going to be proven correct. Both camps are not going to be right. Either there's going to be severe degradation in these really high cost areas, and the people who are moving now are prescient, or the people who stayed are going to reap some kind of gigantic gains as their $1 million house goes to 2 million. But I don't know who's going to be able to afford a $2 million house when they can't even afford the $1 million house.
Well, we need to never forget as we wrap here, Charles, what's behind all of this. The issue is we've lost sound money. When we moved away from sound money, when we were gold backed, to just being to a fiat currency and we could just print it, we started this whole age of really high inflation rates, even though we think it's low from a CPI, but it's not. And it's now transformed definitely into asset inflation. And the wealth effect that is supposedly coming from it, this sustained period of cheap money, artificial money, of what I refer to as monetary malpractice, is at the root of all of these problems. Sustained quantitative easing, we've talked about this many times. That's what's doing it. Okay, so that's the bad news. The good news is that change is inevitable. And maybe, and these migrations that are happening are forcing people to move to areas, and they got different looks at it. So other areas are going to develop. Others that are losing, they're going to have to reset. It's like a company that goes bad. It's got to figure out how to get itself back in balance. Places like Illinois, I don't know how they're going to do it, but they've got to reset. I'm not picking on them, but there's quite a number of states here. You're going to see pension plans that are going to have to fail. There's no way out of it. And of course, the federal government will come in and attempt to bail them out and cause the problems more. But at the end of it, there will be a cleansing mechanism from it. And it could be painful, but a lot of people are saying, I know what's coming. I'm just going to have a little safe place to ride it out. It could be, but hopefully a lot of good stuff will come out of this, just not negatives. Any last comment, Charles, as we wrap here? We covered an awful lot of views on this subject.
Yeah, no, I would say I think you've done I'm glad you brought up the fact that there will be winners as well as losers in this, and that really it's what I would call scale invariance is in play here. If you have a household that's properly managed and fiscally prudent, that household's going to do okay even in a recession. The same is true of cities and counties and states. And if you're fiscally imprudent and you're poorly managed, then you're going to suffer the consequences of that poor management. What we're talking about here is insolvency. You're not going to collect enough to pay your bills.
I'm not being political here. I don't mean to sound it, but if you look at the biggest player they're leaving blue states. It isn't just Trump's recent tax changes that have particularly hurt them. It's been years of imprudent policies and giving away too much money to pensions that clearly shouldn't have been funded at that level, and not funding infrastructure, cutting corners where they shouldn't have been cut for various reasons, and in a lot of cases just out and out illegal graft that's going on, the kind of corruption that's becoming pretty evident in some of these places. So it's just been a lot of bad years of simple bad political governance, and that is going to have to change. And I think another issue besides fiat currency is we just have very poor political leadership. It's become so expedient, and nothing's for the longer term. It's for the next election cycle. And you can't run a company that way. You can't run a small business that way. You've got to balance, tactical and strategic. We just don't think that way. And when you don't, you're going to get into this problem. And we were talking before the show began about the Roman Empire. And what happens is moral decays start to show up. And you've got all sorts of examples of that, of when things are tight, people start to cheat. Not just government, not just politicians, people in general. They start pushing the limit. And then when corruption starts to take hold, societies start to break down because you don't think you're getting your fair share. And we've talked many times about the social contract. I don't mean to be negative here, but these are the realities that people need to come to grips with and figure out what their strategy is. If you're a pensioner, you better understand what's going to be happening to your property tax. Or you're going to be seriously caught behind the 8 ball. That's just being prudent. So with that, Charles, your site, could you mention it, where they could get more of your readings and your writings? You're still doing an article a day, are you not?
Yeah, pretty much. And just come visit me at of2minds.com. And thank you very much, Gordon.
Thank you, and we'll talk to you again next month, Joseph.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.